he bowed out. Tesla redesigned Van Neumann redesigned the equipment. He went to a pulsed mode, upped the power of the transmitters to 2 megawatts each, CW rating, which says at a 10% duty cycle, you had approximately 80 megawatts of RF power, peak power, being pumped into an antenna which was designed by T. Townsend Brown and put on the highest point on the Eldridge. The ship, the Eldridge, was not known by that name at its initial inception, but that was, of course, the name dubbed on it later, DE-173. Among other things that were decided upon was, in the spring of '42, that Van Neumann wanted a special ship chosen and selected from the ground up, right off the drawing board, which it was about July of '42, and which would be specially outfitted for this experiment. They had 2 very large generators at 75 kVA each to be put in the hold, so they left number 2 gun turret unfinished and dropped them in there, mounted them up down below, and then slid them to the final resting place. Also a very large diesel electric generator to power this equipment, about 8 megawatts worth. Rather large. They needed a ship of sufficient size, but they didn't want something the size of a battleship. They wanted something straight off the waves. They also decided to have a special, selected, trained volunteer crew. So the crew went out in the Navy, and some 33 volunteered. They were trained between September and December of '42, or ready after that point. And strangely enough, who was the head of the class, if you will, the schoolmaster, my father. Her pictures still are retained of this, and it's part of my slideshow, which I do during the workshop. So things went on where the ship was launched, went into dry dock, and all the equipment was installed, and it went to dockside in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and came '43, they started equipment tests. About March of '43, Van Neumann also became shaky and decided it was a personnel problem. There would be one. We insisted, we finally agreed, tried to make some corrections to the equipment, was unsuccessful with a 3rd generator, and went back to the original approach in June of '43 with some complications. But we were ready for the actual test come July. The test date was chosen, 20 July '43, it was pushed to 22 July, and at that date, all the personnel involved, my brother and I were chosen to run the equipment. I presume that wasn't decided from the beginning. And we were in a special hold of the ship to run all the equipment. Now understand, in those days there were no computers, so everything had to be run by hand or some type of very exotic electric relay. They chose the former approach, personnel running the equipment. In that morning, we were out on station in Philadelphia Harbor. The order came by radio at 1000 hours, proceed with the test. If any of you have seen the movie, The Philadelphia Experiment by E.M.I. Thorne, the first part of that 12 minutes or so is very accurate, except for the date. So all the equipment was turned on, and for about 15 to 20 minutes from the observer ships, especially one carrier, with Dr. Van Neumann on board and his assistants, the ship became optically and radar invisible. Remember, in 1940, there was no concern about radar. We didn't have any decent radar then, but by '43, in the pressure war development, we had excellent radar. And in '43, the German submarine fleet was seeking approximately 1/2 of all our shipping going across the Atlantic. The desire was to provide some type of cloaking device, which hopefully the Germans, with their radar, could not see through it, that is, the invisibility screen, and the ships could get through without being sunk. The test was completely successful so far as the hardware was concerned. After 20 minutes, the order came, return to dockside, which we did, and then they found they had a problem. The personnel who were deliberately stationed on deck as part of the test were running around nauseous, totally out of it, wandering, and absolutely bewildered and ill. So the Navy pulled the crew off, said they'd give us a new crew, and Van Neumann then knew we had a serious problem, as the rest of us did. Those below decks were not affected because they were shielded by the steel. So he decided he had to do something. He went to the Navy for more time, and they told him, no way. We're giving you a final drop dead date of the 12th of August, 1943. Complete complete your test by then or forget it. So we worked night and day, and we realized, of course, we couldn't make any major changes, but the Navy made one change in requirement. You don't have to have optical invisibility. After all, in those days, there were no satellites, no LORAN, no SHORAN. You were dependent upon either radar or direct optical viewing to know where another ship was in a fleet. So they relaxed the requirement. Didn't know a thing. So we were all a bit ready and a bit apprehensive on the morning of the 12th of August, 43. Went out on station. 900 hours came the order, turn on the equipment, which we did. For the first 60 or 70 seconds, to an outside observer, and there were 3 observing ships at that trip, at that point, a carrier, a smaller ship, and a merchant marine ship known as the SS Freyaseth. It appeared to be very successful. You could see the ship through a haze, a greenish haze, but it was invisible on radar. And after about 70 seconds, there was a flash of blue light, and the ship vanished totally, right out of the harbor, gone. There was absolute pandemonium and panic among the Navy ranks and by Dr. Van Neumann. He could not contact the ship by radio at all. About 4 hours later, the ship returns to the harbor in the same location where it had been, and they immediately spotted through the binoculars that there was something wrong. Part of the mast was broken off and missing. There was some superficial structure damage, and nobody responded to the radio. To send a launch out for seeing what was wrong. They found out as soon as they boarded the ship what was wrong. You had 2 sailors dying in the deck, embedded in the steel, 2 in the bulkheads embedded in the steel, the 5th man with his hand embedded in the steel bulkhead. He lived, put his hand off, gave an artificial hand later. And of those who were on deck, some were missing, others were wandering around in a complete state of mental hysteria, insanity in plain language. They were removed to the funny farms where they lived out their lives, which wasn't very long in most cases. Those below decks were essentially unharmed, except for one man who did the invisibility number periodically. But of course, they had to put another crew on board the ship to bring it back. It was otherwise undamaged. Brought it back to dockside with 4 days of inquiry, what went wrong. I was there to give my testimony, but my brother Duncan was not. He was missing, insofar as the 1943 Navy personnel were concerned. Now, what happened so far as we were concerned? We were on the inside. We were in the control room, and approximately 30 seconds after all equipment was on and operational, things started to flicker and glow strangely, and then to arc over. There were strange electrical arcs inside that room. It continued to get worse. Finally, we decided, because we had been trained what to do in an emergency if it occurred, and we had one, turn the power off. So we grabbed the main power switches, pulled on them, they wouldn't budge. Couldn't move them. And the conditions were getting worse. So we decided out of there, out on deck, to see people running around. At that point, there was no one embedded in the decks. And pandemonium was, at that point, all over. We decided, we got the bright idea, jump overboard. We land in the bay, we can swim ashore. We jumped overboard. We didn't wind up in the bay. We wound up standing on dry land in the inside perimeter of a military installation, which we later found out was Montauk, Long Island, at approximately 2 a.m. in the morning. It was dark. Suddenly there was a bright light overhead, a spotlight, well, a powerful searchlight on a helicopter. We didn't know anything about helicopters at that point, because Sikorsky was still trying to sell them to the government in 43. And we were grabbed MPs and taken to an elevator down below. The elevators opened on a lower level because there were 6 levels of underground at Montauk. We were met by an elderly civilian. Said, "Gentlemen, I've been waiting for you. I'm Dr. Van Neumann." We looked at him and said, "You're who?" I said, "I'm Dr. Van Neumann." He said, "You can't be. We just left him an hour or so ago," and he was a much younger man. He said, "I know." He said, "I am the same man. You are no longer in 1943 or in 1983, and you're at Montauk, Long Island." And he said, "I'm the same man you knew 40 years ago."